My husband's coworker reported him to HR after his response to her insistent. It's incredible how quickly a simple conversation can spiral into something much bigger than expected. That's exactly what happened to my husband after a brief exchange in the office break room, one that escalated into a formal HR complaint. What started as an innocent chat with a coworker quickly turned into a misunderstanding that not only questioned our relationship, but also led to accusations that were completely false and frankly offensive. Let me walk you through what really happened. A few months ago, my husband began a new job with a night shift schedule. This was an adjustment for both of us, as he had been working a regular day job for most of our marriage. The night shifts had their perks and challenges, but one of the unexpected benefits was that he occasionally interacted with morning staff before wrapping up his shift. This meant he sometimes bumped into people outside his regular work circle. It was one of those mornings that this entire situation began. My husband had just wrapped up a late night shift and, as usual, stopped by the break room to grab a drink before heading home for some much-needed sleep. As he was preparing to leave, a coworker noticed his wedding ring. She didn't mention anything initially, but eventually, the conversation began naturally. She asked, "Are you married?" The question, seemingly harmless, soon took an unexpected turn after my husband answered. He replied that he was married and that he and I had been together for 5 years. He was 24 years old at the time, and our marriage had been a happy one. The coworker, who was also in her 20s, raised an eyebrow in surprise. "You're 24, and you've been married for 5 years? You must have been really young when you got married, right?" My husband, trying to be casual, confirmed. "Yes, I was 19, almost 20 when we got married. My wife was just 20. That's when things took a weird and uncomfortable turn. The coworker stared at him with an expression of disbelief. "So, you were a teenager when you got married?" she asked, her voice tinged with judgment. He replied, "Yes, but we were both of legal age when we got married, and it wasn't uncommon for people in our small hometown to marry young. It's just a 5-month age gap." He tried to keep the tone light, not wanting the situation to escalate. But her response was anything but casual. "That sounds like grooming," she said, her tone suddenly accusing. "That's exactly what someone who's been groomed would say." My husband was stunned. The word grooming hit him like a punch to the gut, not just because it was completely unfounded, but because it was such an offensive accusation. He instinctively became protective of me and our relationship. We've always been happy with the choices we made, and we've never let others' opinions affect us. But this was different. He pushed back, saying, "No, it wasn't grooming. We were both over 18 when we got married. It was just a young marriage, but it's worked out beautifully for us." But she didn't stop there. "It's just disgusting," she muttered, shaking her head. "A 20-year-old marrying a teenager, it just doesn't sit right with me." At this point, my husband was starting to feel the anger bubble up. He couldn't understand why she was fixating on their relationship, let alone making such a vile accusation. "Listen, it wasn't grooming," he said firmly. "And even if you think it was, which, again, it wasn't, I'd do it all over again. We've been together for 5 wonderful years." But the coworker wouldn't back down. She kept pushing, seemingly determined to make him feel guilty for his choices. Frustrated, my husband stood his ground and, trying to remain professional, said, "If you continue with these accusations, I'm going to have to report you to HR for your behavior." Her response left him speechless. "Well, I've already reported you to ER," she said, before storming out of the break room, clearly satisfied with herself. My husband stood there for a moment, processing the absurdity of the situation. He'd simply tried to explain our relationship, but now he found himself facing an HR complaint based on an entirely false and offensive accusation. It wasn't just the accusation itself that upset him. It was the fact that this coworker, who barely knew him, was determined to paint him as something he wasn't. After leaving work that day, my husband called me to tell me what had happened. I was absolutely floored. We've dealt with our share of comments about how young we were when we married, but no one had ever accused us of something as serious as grooming. I couldn't believe someone would be so quick to judge our happiness, especially when they didn't know anything about us. Determined not to let this slide, my husband decided to call HR to explain what had happened from his side. He wanted to ensure they understood the full context. When he spoke to HR, they were confused. They hadn't fully grasped what she was accusing him of, and they seemed just as perplexed as he was. The HR representative asked my husband to explain what had happened. The tone in her voice was calm, professional, but there was a definite tension in the air as she leaned forward, awaiting his response. He sat back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly as he began recounting the events in detail. His voice was steady but tinged with frustration as he explained that, while he fully understood his own response may not have been the most professional, the accusations levied against him had been completely baseless. As he spoke, he couldn't help but relive the moment. It had been a typical day at work, nothing out of the ordinary, until one of his coworkers, a woman in her early 20s, had made an accusation that left him stunned. She had claimed that his behavior toward her was inappropriate, that he was somehow grooming her, suggesting that his actions were predatory. The accusation seemed to come out of nowhere, and my husband could not believe it. There had been no flirtation, no improper behavior, nothing that could even remotely justify such an extreme claim. He had been caught off guard by the accusation and, in the heat of the moment, had responded defensively. He explained how the confrontation had escalated quickly, how her accusation had triggered a sense of injustice in him, prompting him to defend himself. He admitted that, yes, his response could have been better, perhaps he could have been more level-headed. But at that moment, he felt cornered. He wasn't just defending his actions, he was defending his character, his integrity. The HR representative listened attentively, nodding as he spoke. After a moment of silence, she spoke again. "I can understand how upsetting that must have been," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Your response, while understandable, could have been handled with more professionalism. However, given the seriousness of the accusation, I don't believe this is something that warrants formal punishment. You were simply defending yourself against a serious and frankly unfair claim." My husband exhaled in relief, knowing that his job wasn't at risk over a moment of frustration. Still, it didn't erase the feeling of injustice that lingered. He had worked hard to build his reputation at that company, and to have it called into question over something as baseless as this was infuriating. The HR rep, sensing his frustration, leaned forward a bit more. "If you feel strongly about this, we can certainly file a formal complaint against your coworker," she said. For her aggressive behavior and the unfounded nature of her accusation, it might be necessary to document this, especially if this situation escalates further. After a moment's pause, my husband agreed. "Yes," he said, his voice resolute. "I think it's important that the truth be known. This wasn't a case of grooming, it was a misunderstanding, poor judgment on her part." With the decision made, the conversation moved forward. The HR representative assured him that they would investigate further, starting with reviewing the security camera footage from that day to verify the events. Although my husband wasn't particularly concerned about what they would find, he did find it irritating that it had come to this. He wasn't worried about the footage after all. He knew there had been nothing inappropriate. But it bothered him to think that this simple exchange had turned into something so ugly, with his coworker so quick to jump to conclusions without considering the facts. Later that afternoon, HR reached out again. They confirmed that they were reviewing the footage and that they would be in touch soon with their findings. This news didn't surprise my husband, who had expected it. What did surprise him was how the entire situation had spun out of control so quickly. A simple disagreement had become an accusation of something much darker, something completely unfounded. To give a bit of context to those who might not fully understand why this situation felt so surreal to both of us, it's important to know where we come from. Both my husband and I hail from a small town in the deep south, where young marriages are common. It's not unusual to see couples get married in their late teens or early 20s, and it's rarely met with much scrutiny. In fact, it's typically seen as a natural part of life. People marry young, start families early, and build their futures together. The idea of getting married at a young age is, in that environment, considered normal. But since we moved to the West Coast, things have been different. We've encountered different attitudes, different values. People here are often more cautious about marriage, more focused on career or education before settling down. We've had the occasional comment about our ages, a raised eyebrow here or there, but nothing even remotely close to what we experienced at work. We never thought that something as harmless as our marriage could be so easily misinterpreted. What shocked me even more was how I reacted to the whole situation. It started innocently enough. I posted about what had happened on social media. I wanted to know if anyone else thought the coworker's reaction was as unreasonable as we did. I was seeking validation, sure, but also some clarity. We were confused, hurt, and upset by the accusation, and I just wanted to understand if we were the only ones who thought it was out of line. But when I woke up the next morning, I was completely taken aback. The post had gone viral. The number of comments, likes, and shares was overwhelming. People were reaching out, offering support, and agreeing that the coworker's accusations were unfounded. I was grateful for all the kind words, but also a bit stunned by the attention. It felt good to know that others saw our side of things, that they believed in the validity of our marriage, and recognized that the accusation of grooming was simply not true. It's hard to describe the wave of emotions that hit me. I had always been protective of my husband, and seeing people rally behind us, especially in the face of such an absurd accusation, was both comforting and empowering. The kindness we received from strangers, from people who had no personal stake in our lives, reminded me that there was still good in the world, and that people were more likely to stand up for what was right than to judge us based on outdated or misguided assumptions. Of course, there were also some points of contention in the comments that needed clarification. Many people were curious about the age gap between us and our coworker. Yes, my husband had mentioned that the coworker was 20 years old, which, in context, seemed important. While she was technically an adult, she was still quite young, and her perspective might have been shaped by her own limited experiences. There were also people who expressed confusion over HR's response to the complaint, asking if they had acted appropriately. From what we understood, HR was genuinely puzzled by her complaint. They simply couldn't make sense of what she had accused my husband of, and after hearing his side of the story, they seemed to agree that the accusation lacked merit. However, there was one part of my husband's comment that did raise eyebrows. He had mentioned something in the heat of the moment about being groomed voluntarily. While we understood his frustration, this comment was clearly unprofessional, and he quickly admitted as much. He wasn't proud of it, and he apologized for letting his emotions get the better of him. There was also speculation about whether the coworker might have been attracted to my husband. I hadn't considered it, but now, in hindsight, I suppose it was possible. My husband is undeniably handsome, though he would never admit it, and I love to tease him about it. He's the kind of guy who genuinely doesn't notice when people flirt with him. It's part of what I love about him. He's so committed to me that it never crosses his mind to entertain the advances of others. But some people wondered if maybe the coworker had misinterpreted his actions. It's an uncomfortable thought, but not an impossible one. Despite all the attention, there were still a few people who questioned whether this whole situation was real. Some thought it sounded too dramatic, too far-fetched to be true. But I assure you, everything I've shared here is 100% real. When my husband came home and told me what had happened, I knew I had to share it with others. This wasn't about seeking attention or validation. It was about sharing a story that, unfortunately, many people could relate to. I didn't care about internet fame or popularity. I just wanted to show that this kind of thing can happen to anyone, and it's important to speak out when it does. In closing, I want to thank everyone who took the time to offer us their support. Over the years, we've faced a lot of judgment for marrying young, and it's been hard at times. But this experience has shown me that there are people out there who understand, who support us, and who stand by us. My husband and I have built a life together, and it hasn't always been easy. But he has been an incredible partner, and I wouldn't change a thing. We've faced challenges, but we've faced them together. As for HR's investigation, they assured us they would pull the footage from the cameras to see if anything else needed to be addressed. Honestly, though, I don't expect much to come of it. The cameras at work don't even overlap with the night crew's shifts, so I doubt they'll find anything significant. For now, we're just trying to move forward from this confusing, frustrating experience. I'll keep everyone updated if anything changes. But for now, we're focusing on the positives and continuing with our lives.